Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here, and I know there are a lot of hungry souls in the office, in the studio, in the space, but we'll just dive into it. Architecture can be that sort of bridge where infrastructure development is, address gaps in infrastructure, or for that matter, even public art could be seen as infrastructure. Now, when we set up the agenda, where we sort of work with, based on the philosophy of design as research, and we sort of identify first what the research gap is. What is the big, broad question that we want to ask ourselves, and the questions that we also want to ask the clients. So we start with the whole idea of the research question and what are the research aim and objectives. That forms the broad framework of the research methodology. Now, based on that, you have your qualitative and your quantitative data sets. And with the quantitative data, we then resort to a lot of computer-based simulations, algorithms, and some of these could be very, very practical sort of outputs like solar radiation analysis, windrow, so on and so forth. Besides form-finding strategies, using data as form makers, understanding vectors of movement and trajectories and so on and so forth. And then we're also slightly old-fashioned in that sense, in the sense that we like that sort of human-centric approach where we also look at bottom-up processes, speaking to people, through questionnaires, through that sort of human touch and human contact. There's also the realm of case studies. It's always wonderful to be actually walking through a building, seeing it in flesh, understanding what that space entails. And there's also the library of research, which also entails material library sets. So that forms the basis of statistical analysis, and also the content analysis that forms the integrated analysis approach. So the first project is the Bookworm Pavilion, and we're just going to share with you a bunch of projects. And this was at the hallowed grounds of the CSMES Museum in Mumbai. And this was a heritage site. Our brief was that we couldn't even put a nail into the ground. And we came up with this idea of creating this deployable pavilion made out of recycled timber, which could be deployed on site in quick time, fabricated offshore, and assembled in quick time as well. But we resorted to the simple A-frame ladder, and when you see the A-frame ladder, there's a hinge at the top where you can actually change the angle of the ladder, which allows you to actually use the ladder to store books, or the horizontals of the ladder to store books, or when they actually spread across an angle, you could, or they're more parallel to the ground, you could be sitting on them. So this was the whole idea of using an array of these sort of ladders that sort of flow through the landscape. And it's interesting because the cross-section changes at every 450 millimeters. This is the sort of space that you get and what kids actually, move through. And I'm sure you've heard of the concept of getting lost in a good book, but how about getting lost in a good building? There's also the idea of, the building itself is a book, and each corner whispers a different story. There's a lot of intrigue, there's a lot of discovery where children are concerned. And the way it just sort of meanders through the landscape allows kids to be sitting, browsing, and then sitting and actually reading. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Bookworm Pavilion is the community participation, in the sense that every book was donated by a well-wisher or a school that had the actual resources to lend out these books, or even individuals. So the Bookworm could basically house about 12,000 to 15,000 books, right? So every round that the Bookworm deploys, it can actually generate a corpus of 15,000 books that after its sort of life at one site, can be donated back into government schools, rural schools, so on and so forth. And you know what that sort of corpus means? About 7.5 lakh or 10 lakh rupees of books that get donated back into government schools. And you know the sort of, some of the infrastructure that's there. A lot of libraries are not well equipped. They do not have the means and resources to invest in that sort of amount. So that was the big sort of story of the Bookworm Pavilion, where, this amazing sort of participation by the community, and also the act of curation by the museum. So fantastic work done by the museum to curate the content and push it out there so it's all readable for children of all ages. So imagine strolling through a structure that's not just walls and a roof, but it's an ode to the literary universe. And the great thing about this was that the ladder was the structural element, it was the programmatic element, and it was also the element that actually served the function of storing books and allowing people to sit as well. So just one simple system can result in a completely different typology. We also extremely fascinated by the thematic area of education and how education leads to empowerment. We've done a few schools. This was a school where we actually worked on a very dynamic sort of skin, which was facing, the harsh sort of southern direction, and allowed the breeze to flow in through, but it's a sort of brise-soleil, but a very dynamic sort of skin behind which the activities of the school sort of unfold. So this is about 1 lakh square feet. This is another school in a completely different context, which is in Warangal. Warangal is about 3 hours from Hyderabad. And very close to the site, we encountered this beautiful fort, which had these thick, massive walls, and these massive walls you could actually live in. So we were very sort of inspired by this sense of fortification and the sense of creating something which is monolithic, but you could carve through and allow spaces for children to discover, nest within these walls, and also interact the way they actually spilled out from the main playground area into these smaller sort of courtyards. These courtyards served as refuge areas, smaller sort of microclimatic spaces, where they could actually dodge, the harsh sun, and even play during, your break time, lunch break, so on and so forth. So you see a lot of these courts are shaded. This is another school we won a competition. It's called The Forest, and this is also interesting because this is a nice example to illustrate that how architecture can address that gap in infrastructure. Now, the sort of plight of some of our cities where air pollution is a big sort of big issue. There are issues of, a lot of investment in motorized infrastructure, but very little investment in non-motorized infrastructure, where you see people hawking on the streets and people walking on the roads, and, two-wheelers plying on pedestrian walks, debris spilled all over, and these are common sights. So we went through and we started discussing, what is the sort of aspiration of the stakeholders, the community around it, and teachers and students. And they gave us all of this, that what about, creating this sort of, addressing this gap in infrastructure. And we started to create these two circular cylindrical rotundas, which are these sort of green elements, which we capped with this infinity loop track. Now, the idea of the school is not that it starts at 8 o'clock in the morning and ends at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but how can a school actually be a 24/7 cultural space? How can the community engage with that space? So whether it's used for walking or cycling or workshops, discussions, meetings, community engagement, community interaction, all that is sort of possible. And that's how it sort of sits in the landscape. In the center of these rotundas, we've got these nice green spaces, which also drive home the concept of this connect with nature. How could children understand this relationship between nature and nurture? How could they actually understand, this hands-on experience of seeding and allowing things to grow and change and transform and adapt? And how does that sort of build into the green sort of curriculum? So these were some sort of discussions we've been having, but that's how it sort of sits in the skyline. Taking on that aspect, we also worked on another pavilion called the Edible Pavilion, which is again at the museum lawns. And basically the multi-purpose pavilion includes spaces for interaction, includes an amphitheater, spaces for performance, exhibitions, presentations, workshops, and storytelling, right? So if you see there are a lot of these sort of pixels or voxels that are sort of aggregated together to create an amphitheater on the roof, and within the interiority, you have spaces where children could actually meander and explore. So the pavilion is designed as a multi-purpose space to foster a sense of love and respect for food, cultivation, and life cycle amongst children. It is fabricated from renewable sources such as wood, and timber is a very highly sustainable material. The same can be grown and harvested several times, provided it comes from a forest, which is designed for that sort of purpose. Of course, there's this incredible harmonious dialogue between tradition and innovation, because it's part of this incredible site which has these heritage structures around it and the heritage lawns. So we also wanted to honor this timeless narrative. How could you actually create something within these hallowed grounds, a space where ancient whispers meet contemporary elegance, in a matter of speaking. The edible pavilion houses green elements. So there are a lot of green elements. The whole idea of this pavilion was to promote concepts such as urban farming. How do you introduce children to farming at an early age? And there are lots of programs that have been curated and structured around the pavilion. How do you actually sensitize children to the value of food and the production cycle? In addition, the pavilion also houses air purifying plants and also medicinal plants. So it's a nice sort of exposure at a very early age to the role of nature in our lives. Just to summarize where this project is concerned, it aims at instilling in children of all ages life skills such as growing food, working hard, being patient, respecting the planet's resources, and improved communication. So that sort of helps them, builds their confidence and other sort of skills, including motor skills. So these are just images of just the way the light sort of plays into the space. It's almost like a very thick sort of voxelized pergola which cuts down the solar radiation, and depending upon the time of the day, they can be sitting inside, outside. These are some workshops that have been curated by a lot of NGOs around the same thematic area, and just the way it sort of sits in the landscape. One interesting aspect is how this material aged very quickly. So it's done with this spruce, fir and pine, and there's almost this sort of carbonization, almost like what a patina does. It sort of becomes, gray and becomes darker as it's exposed to sunlight. So that was nice to see how it sort of aged and sort of changed. And this also brought about, for us, what it sort of means, what it meant in terms of an architecture of impermanence. These are sort of certain revelations that we discovered as a practice. What does it mean to us, both with the bookworm and the edible pavilion? So these sort of, I like the public art space because it sort of brings that fearlessness inside. And what you bring from architectural discourse into public art is also the aspect of social connects and how you can make a serious social impact. This is a project in Nevada. This is a competition that was held, and we were, one of the, there were 10 entries selected to build prototypes and eventually build the project. This is at Fly Ranch, which is about 3,800 acres, very close to Burning Man Festival, but it's a completely different ecosystem, right? So it's very rich and it's very diverse, not as dry as the playa of the Burning Man. And the whole idea was to actually create this massive, solar mountain, so to speak, inspired by the surrounded by the surrounding topography. These were, just to give you an idea of the scale, the width of that span is about 30 meters, so it's about 100 feet. The smallest headroom is 4.5 meters, and at the highest pitch, it's about 14 meters. So that's almost like a ground plus 4-story structure, almost 5 stories once you're inside. So it's quite colossal. And our structural consultants were AKT T2 from London. Hanif Kara and Edward did a fantastic job. We were sure we wanted to do it in timber. They brought in the concept of CLT, which is cross-laminated timber. It can have a very light footprint, and just the way it was detailed with, a very small proportion of metal parts, for connectors and bolts was very, very interesting. So here you can actually see, the different layers of the structural system, right from the base to the vertical supports, to the glulam members, to the main A-frame trusses, and then you also had the purlins that actually support the solar panels. There was also solar radiation analysis done, so we said, how do we orient it? And the clients were also sort of very generous. They said, okay, there's 3,800 acres, where do you want to put this in? And we trekked for almost a week before we found a beautiful spot that was kind of leveled. And we decided that we go for a north-south direction. So the first diagram on the left is where you get maximum solar incidence. And the one at the bottom right is where you rotate it 90 degrees to the north. And here you can see the blues and yellows. You don't see the oranges. So that was sort of interesting. So this is at prototyping stage. This is a competition called the Rainwater Catcher, and the whole idea was that we wanted to talk about the concept of water equals life. So we wanted to actually create, a water temple where you go and actually worship water in an indirect manner of speaking. But we wanted to create this tower that actually celebrates the role and importance of water in our everyday lives. The idea was to actually aid water conservation and climate change and celebrate the sensory experience of water, as well as the adaptation of technology through its iconic form. The idea of placemaking becomes very, very central. So we refrain from the idea of the conventional tower where people go to the top, have a quick view of the outside. This is not very high. Just to give you an idea of scale, this is about 1/4 the height of the Eiffel Tower, or maybe a little more than that. So there was no great advantage of going to the top and seeing the views of the hills or whatever. And we wanted to create this interior space, like almost being in this colossal temple, which is 200 meters high. And we wanted to create that space, the idea of placemaking, as I said, within this sort of water temple. And we were hoping that this space can serve as an experiential installation space, and can evoke the human senses of touch, light, sound, and smell. And it's a place for learning, discovery, reflection, dialogue, interaction amongst like-minded people as well. So this is how it sort of works as a cross-section. And what's interesting is that if you see on the right of the cross-section, there is the Guadalupe River that you probably saw in the aerial view. Now, the Guadalupe River is a very sacred historic site, and for us it was important for us to have that sort of connection with the Guadalupe River and create that sort of cycle, water cycle through the tower, and just the way the tower actually then responds and communicates to the Guadalupe River. The form of the rainwater catcher is, of course, derived through fluid algorithmic flowing lines inspired by natural systems. And the idea of the tower is also, like I said, as an extension of the landscape. So we wanted to create this big sort of step landscape so people could sit around and you activate that sort of sense of belonging within that space, spend time there, increase dwell time, and have a bunch of activities as well. This is a project that we're working on in Ujjain. It's a wellness retreat and very interesting program. So it's got everything from a yoga space to dormitories, to villas by the riverfront, to, of course, counseling areas and classrooms, and there are restaurants and cafes. There's also a temple. There are green veggie patches where you can actually grow your food, and that food goes back into the kitchen and then gets processed for consumption in the restaurant. And then you have rainwater harvesting pits as well. One of the interesting aspects was we wanted to create these domes where people could actually go to the rooftop and also do yoga out in the open. And therefore, we came up with these very simple construction method to create these steps out of domes where people could be sitting on the top or they could be sitting on the inside. There was also this risk of the rising river levels because of annual flooding. And instead of creating a very strong, stone concrete dam wall, we decided to create that resilience for flooding through seeding that whole topography with trees and plantation, of course, with the landscape consultant, to actually create a very interesting sort of barrier to build that resilience against annual flooding. And hopefully we're hoping that one day, once the vegetation actually grows, then architecture actually diminishes. It vanishes completely, and all you're left is with is a landscape, and therefore the role of architecture is more as a scaffolding rather than creating very strong, vigorous sort of structures that cannot adapt and change with time. This is another very small, interesting project, but very, very dear to me. It's a tree house, very simple tree house, and I always wanted to do a tree house. And this is at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew. It was a 3-stage competition. We made it to the 3rd stage. And this was held by the Museum of Architecture and the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. They launched a competition to design tree houses at the Kew UNESCO World Heritage Site. And as you know, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew is a global conservation center of plant and fungal life. So that's what the whole purpose of this was. And really, we wanted to just create a very simple sort of diagram of, how you could have a house that is the hybridization of a house, tree, and landscape, and what does it actually give you. So we wanted to explore this relationship. As you've noticed, this tree is not at a huge altitude, and there's a reason for that. We wanted it to be accessible by persons with reduced mobility. So people with wheelchairs could access that tree house. It wasn't too high. There's also a constraint because the specific tree that we were given on site was the silver lime tree. And that silver lime tree had a lot of these branches at a low height, and you couldn't really push it up to the top. But for us, it became very interesting because when we visited the site in winter, all we could see is leaves at the bottom, and we just saw this beautiful, big, wireframe skeleton of the tree. And we said, oh, wow, can we actually build a tree house with these leaves? And that sort of bore the seed of creating the skin for the tree house, which is almost like a leafy-like system around the main structure. The panels change angle, so depending upon where you are, maybe it directs you to the ground, to the mulch, or it directs you out into the Royal Botanic Garden landscape, or maybe it directs you up into the sky. So that's what it sort of does, and it sort of changes as you move through the space. There's also this nice sort of space between the two ramps that you can just stand there, have, sit there, or just look up into this beautiful silver lime tree. The central piece is not the tree house. The central piece, the raison d'etre of this project is, of course, the tree. And how do we frame this tree? How can we all be tree huggers and just go and hug that beautiful tree throughout the year was something that was very critical for us. So we wanted the tree house also to frame the tree and the circulation to move around that tree house in a matter of speaking that people from all age groups, young, old, senior citizens could go and enjoy the tree house. We didn't see the tree house as merely a space where you have to be, a small little toddler, or a little, 8-year-old or 9-year-old who climbs up and runs up. But we wanted to also to sort of tap on the memories of, a lot of senior citizens who could go back and connect with their childhood, in a matter of speaking. So that was that. This is a project that we're working in Switzerland. It's basically a viewing tower, and this client of ours has a beautiful site, and it's very close. It's about one and a half hour from Zurich, and he has this nice, beautiful restaurant at the bottom, and this road is frequented by a lot of bikers and people who actually just want to go down the road and through the Alps and experience that stunning, beautiful landscape. And he said, okay, I want to actually create this tower, keep the restaurant at the bottom, but I wanted to create this place where people can engage and enjoy the vistas of the landscape. And these are some of the breathtaking shots of, all the sort of the landscape and the flora and the fauna that you can experience when you're on site, and the stunning, landscape views. So we wanted to work with the idea of the Edelweiss, which is the flower, and how does this sort of this pattern emerge from the ground up, and how does this tower actually become this extension of the landscape? As you see on the left, you have this big sort of circular plate which houses the indoor restaurant and the back of house services and your kitchen and all of that, with service entries and all of that. And at the top, then you have a deck, so you can actually go to the top level and you could sit out and even have a nice coffee there. And then you spiral up all the way up to the top of the viewing tower. And this is the sort of structural system that we're foreseeing, which will again be a hybridization or a hybrid structural system with steel and timber. This is a mosque that we completed in Mumbai, and of course, we were working with this idea of the mashrabiyah. And if you know, the word mashrabiyah stems from the word ashrab. Ashrab basically means to drink. And earlier, it was defined as a space to drink water. The term later evolved as a space to cool water stored in earthen pots. So if you see the cross-section on your right, you will see an earthen potted jar, which is porous, and it's filled with water. And once water actually drifts through the pot, it cools the interior air through the concept of evaporative cooling. What is also interesting is to study the DNA of the mashrabiyah. And you can see there's a top, there's a body, and there's the base. And the body is very interesting because the body is also then broken up into three segments. The top of the body has a slightly larger aperture, which will allow hot air to escape through. The center piece is more like a micro-perforated screen, which is also the concept of the whale, but doesn't allow a lot of hot air to blow in through. And then there are these shutters at the bottom, and the shutters are hinged in a way that they could actually deflect the wind depending upon the direction of the wind. These were some operative temperature analysis with the mashrabiyah and without the mashrabiyah. And we started working on these patterns because we are very inspired by Islamic geometric patterns. And we wanted to work with these differentiated levels of patterns. In this case, we were working with an 8-pointed star. And depending upon the program inside, where you need more visibility, or we wanted to reduce the solar radiation, the pattern swells out or becomes much smaller. This was the main sort of entry point through the bottom, and at the top of this is a terrace. Now it's all green and very stunning and beautiful, and it changes color. And that serves as a spillover to the main prayer hall. So you actually can step out on that terrace onto the top. This is how we also wanted to explore the theme of the mosque through the lens of Islamic architecture, where light plays an essential role in designing these religious structures. So we wanted to explore this relationship between light, Islamic geometrical patterns, and build form to create this very experiential space, both during daytime and nighttime. These are some other sort of close-up images, and of course, the main building that houses the prayer hall faces the west towards the sacred Kaaba in Mecca. And the social hall on the ground floor then spills over into the green lawns. There are lots of, basically this project had three components. There was a religious component, there was an educational component, and there was a social component. So that became very interesting just to see how these components could be layered programmatically and work with some of the side constraints that we had. This is a project that we worked on in South Korea, and very interesting. The whole idea of this was how could we do a project that transforms, like the idea of commute to community, and there's been a lot of talk about investment in urban infrastructures in cities like Mumbai and across India. And we saw this as an opportunity where architecture can actually then address also infrastructure. So we also try to work on projects that could be tested at different scales or at different sort of scales of operation. Now, what became very interesting was that we wanted to change the bridge's role from a mere transport corridor into a very vibrant, multifunctional space. There's also this idea of creating this very sacred sort of connection with the Han River. And, the part of the brief was also, and we won't take full credit for this, but they did give in the brief that you could actually build islands around the main spine of the bridge because this river was prone to seasonal flooding. And we leapt at that brief to create these resilient islands where the community could actually come out of the undercover of the spine and the bridge to even be just under an open, beautiful sky and connect with the river and connect back with the skyline of the city. So we saw this bridge as a very symbolic thread that weaves together the past, present, and future of South Korea and also the urban fabric. We also wanted to create this tangible connection between the people and the river, and that river holds a great deal of cultural significance. So these are just some aerial shots. This is what the actual, like under the bridge, the existing bridge, where you have cycle tracks and you have amphitheaters and you know, spaces where, you know, there could be some interaction. And these are the islands. So you can actually step out onto the island and see and experience the skyline. As I mentioned earlier, there are amphitheaters there. They could be used for performance spaces and a lot of landscape and stuff like that. So the idea structurally, we wanted to work with the concept of floating islands rather than something which is, you know, more pier-based and, you know, starts sort of creating incisions into the riverbed. And the whole idea of the transformative power of infrastructure and public space to shape collective memories and aspirations of the people. Thank you.